organizing principles behind each of these centers of excellence, and they're different. So you don't have to have, say, 3 centers of excellence that are all organized around the same organizing principle. You could say, I'm going to have an application organization, I'm going to have a technological organization, I'm going to have a testing-focused automation organization, and that can work. Okay, so finally, outsourced testing service providers. There can be various reasons for using an outsourced testing service provider, leveraging skills, as I mentioned before, or infrastructure in the case of compatibility testing. It's a common and a good reason to use an outside testing service provider. If you don't need to build those skills, you don't need to purchase that infrastructure, why do it? Another reason that we've seen with some of our clients is that there can be kind of politically delicate tasks that have to be done from a test point of view for whatever reason. The results are likely to be very controversial, and rather than make some individual or individuals within a test team be the lightning rod, you hand it off to an outside organization. Let them get scorched. So you know, that can help. Handling the peak workloads that can arise. If you just have great fluctuations in the amount of testing work that needs to be done, particularly if there's a lot of, say, manual regression testing that has to be done, it's just not possible to do it in an automated fashion. It has to be done manually. You know, a lot of this manual regression testing that pops up every time you enter a test execution period but then goes away, that could be a reason to use an outsourced testing service provider. And notice that that's completely different than the leveraging of skills and infrastructure, right? So the right vendor in one situation wouldn't necessarily be the right vendor in another situation. In some cases, when there's outsourced development being done, it's desirable to have testing relatively near those developers, so you select a testing service provider that's located close, at least in the same time zone, so there can be communication. And, of course, reduction in cost is always another consideration. But it's important from an organizational point of view, if you're going to use outsourced testing service providers, understand why you're doing it. We've seen a lot of clients where they really didn't think through this, I won't say a lot, but enough. They didn't really think through very carefully why they wanted to do it. They had pain related to testing. They thought that they could make that pain go away by, you know, collecting it up and throwing it over the fence. But that typically doesn't work, because if you've got a messy situation that's contained to a single site, throwing it 10,000 miles one way or the other around the globe, it's not going to get less messy when it lands. It's now become more messy. Okay, so some things to think about if you are going to do outsourced testing. Selection of the right service provider, again, based on skills. Figuring out how to divide up the testing work to be done so that the appropriate tasks are given to the appropriate people, appropriate groups. Logistics, there are a lot of logistical issues that are associated with any kind of distributed work, and that has to be carefully planned and organized before the work starts in earnest. Mapping, integration, and standardization, in other words, plugging this outsourced group into your project in a way that fits, where the interfaces are well defined, the language is common. Understanding project risks. There are specific sets of project risks that arise anytime you use outsourcing, and those should be identified and managed in advance rather than reacted to when they become a crisis. Good working relationships with the people on the other side is also very important. Teams tend to become very inefficient if they waste a lot of their time and energy squabbling, or if there's a lot of mistrust and you're spending a lot of time trying to catch somebody screwing up. You know, the time you spend trying to catch somebody screwing up is, of course, time you don't spend doing your work, right? So when I talk about building effective working relationships, this is not some sort of, you know, let's all sit around by the campfire, play kumbaya, and, you know, roast marshmallows, right? This has actual practical effects. It's not just about getting along with people you work with. It's also about working effectively and efficiently. And staying focused. A lot of distracting events can occur in outsourced situations, and it's important to stay focused on the testing work that's to be done. Any one of these things, if you do not organize carefully, can really torpedo the success of an outsourced testing effort. So, these, I would say, these are the critical 7 things that if you're going to embark in outsourced testing, make sure that you've thought through each of these 7 things as part of your plan and your strategy. Okay. So to briefly recap, before we go into the Q&A session, the life cycle choices can create different organizational challenges, and I've outlined some of those. It's important that when we organize for our testing efforts that we think about what's the life cycle, what are the organizational challenges associated with it, how am I going to overcome those. They all can be overcome, or at least managed, but if they are not managed, then they will become a source of ongoing issues and problems. Skills is something else that you have to look at when you're organizing your team. And if you're doing distributed testing, you have to look at the way that the skills availability will differ from one region to the next, understanding, again, that skills triangle that I talked about earlier. Decide on specialization versus generalization as an organizing principle for your team, or you can have some specialization and some generalization as well, but figure out how you're going to use those different options and the pros and cons associated with them. How will you manage the potential disadvantages? If you're going to use non-testers, then again, how do we create a work environment, organizational work environment, in which those non-testers can be profitably employed and in a way that's satisfying to them as well as to you, because you don't want them going away from the test organization saying, God, what a mess. I don't ever want to get involved in that again. Oh, that's okay. For those of you not in the room, we had a little pop-up reminder here. So, proper use of non-testers, testing centers of excellence as a particular way of organizing a specialized sub-team within the larger testing organization. Use of testing service providers to give you additional options, particularly things like specialized skills, specialized infrastructure, peak workload, and so forth. So these are all things to think about as you're organizing your testing, you're putting together your test organization. And if you consider all of these issues and effectively manage them, then you should be able to put together a very effective and efficient test organization. Conversely, if you fail to manage some of these things, they can prove to be real irritants at test, and in some cases real obstacles, maybe not insurmountable obstacles, but major obstacles to getting your test work done. So I'd encourage you on your projects to think through all of these. Okay, so as usual, I will put the advertisement up here as we go into the Q&A session. That concludes the presentation as a whole. So at this point, I'm going to take questions from the audience. For those of you on the phone, you can use the webinar Q&A feature, and we'll start with our anonymous, undisclosed host here. If there are any questions, happy to take them. Yeah, please.
So I had a question about the Agile slide that you had. You talked through some of the issues there.